Hi, this is Chris with firstcenturychristianity.net. Today I'm talking about Lazarus and the new mixed multitude. There's something that happens in the New Testament, but particularly in John 12, that if you know to look for it, it'll kind of spark your memory from something that happens in the Torah. In the Torah, we had people at the base of Mount Sinai who were not Israelites. It was actually a mixed multitude of believers who heard the voice of God when he uttered the Ten Commandments. So we have the benefit in our way of understanding the Bible from Genesis to Revelation, and that the expectations for mankind, the belief and the actions that we have to associate with that belief remain pretty much static from Genesis all the way to Revelation. We at firstcenturychristianity.net, at our ministry, we're a messianic ministry. We focus on how the faith was established in the first century and how the new believers joined by learning to keep the commandments and keeping the Sabbath and keeping the festival days, and basically joining the family of God by accepting Yeshua as the Messiah, or Jesus as the Christ, as it's also known. So this is very blessings just abound when you approach the Bible from that perspective. When you approach it as the faith of Abraham, of Isaac, of Jacob, of Zechariah, Isaiah, Jeremiah is the same as the faith of Yeshua and Peter and Paul and James and Bartholomew. When you look at it as one total story, it makes a lot more sense. And it not, rather than having this break, this big break, some point in the first century where they kind of turn their back on the Old Testament. And when you realize that that didn't actually happen, that they continued in the same faith for the Bible writers for their entire lives, and you approach the Bible from this perspective, you can see a lot more information, particularly in how the Bible works in these cycles of events that kind of repeat and get bigger at each interval. So to start the story here, to set the table, we're going to talk about the mixed multitude in Exodus. So in Exodus 12:37-38, now the sons of Israel journeyed from Rameses to Succoth, about 600,000 men on foot, aside from children. A mixed multitude also went up with them, along with flocks and herds and a very large number of livestock. Well, first thing that we notice is that the people who were at the base of Mount Sinai when Yahweh spoke the Ten Commandments were not just Israelites. It was a mixed multitude of people, between 2 and 3 million. These are people who went through the plagues, the 10 plagues that Israel went through, and Egypt went through, and somewhere along the way, people who were not Israel realized that they needed to hitch their wagon to this new Elohim, this new God that was destroying the gods of the Egyptians and laying waste to that society. There's also another reason that people would want to leave with the Israelites, is that once these, million plus slaves leave, then Egypt is going to put more work on the people who are still there, and they are not going to want to be slaves. So these folks are motivated to go off into the unknown, to leave Egypt just like the Israelites, even though Moses was not technically their leader. And they show up at the base of Mount Sinai as a mixed multitude. They hear the Ten Commandments, and from that point forward, we don't hear about a mixed multitude anymore. They've made their decision. They've joined the family of God. They became one nation, and they moved forward in that fashion. We have the same paradigm today in our lives. It's with individuals who can accept Jesus as the Messiah, Yeshua as the Christ, and accept him as the Son of God, and you can become a child of God. You can be grafted into Israel and join the family, which is the avenue for salvation. So early in Yeshua's ministry, actually right at the beginning of it, in Luke 4, he started talking about this, and the Jews weren't having it. Because what happened to Israel is once they became one people and they heard the commandments, they go into across the Jordan 40 years later, they defeat Canaanites, they get their land, and they immediately start going after the false gods. And that leads to their destruction repeatedly. They get carried off into Babylon. They come back after 70 years. They read the Torah. Nehemiah and Ezra read the Torah out loud. And the people who can understand Hebrew explain to those who were born in Babylon that, these are the laws. This is the Torah. And what they do is they make a physical and metaphorical barrier between, at this point, the Jewish people and the rest of the world. They expel any of the children who were born of mixed marriages, and they become quite insular. They want Torah for Jews, and the rest of the nations can do whatever they want to do. It's very hard to join at this point. It becomes harder to join as time goes on because you have to convert to Judaism rather than just become circumcised and join Israel. You have a conversion process that grows up over time. So Luke 4, when Yeshua starts his earthly ministry, he provokes them to kick him out of the synagogue by pointing out that Yahweh did miracles with Gentiles in the days of Elijah and Elisha. He did miracles with people who were not Jews to remind them that they didn't have the monopoly. They had the monopoly on the truth, but that Yahweh is the creator of the heavens and the earth and all that are in them, and that he is the God of all people who will accept him as such. So he starts to allude to this, and we have a mixed multitude that shows up right before he's crucified, if you know to look for it. So here in the Gospel of John, which we've been studying at our assembly, and if you want to watch those studies, they're about an hour and a half long. They're pretty long. They're interactive. They're very detailed, and you're going to hear things from the Bible that are completely true and completely easy to figure out, but that your Sunday minister has never even contemplated because of this perception that there's a break between Malachi and Matthew, that there's this big, huge shift in the first century away from the commandment keeping and from the nations, from Israel to the nations, rather to say. But when we realize that the faith is one continual story, the faith of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is the same as the faith of Yeshua, Paul, Peter, and Timothy. And that's the same faith that we're supposed to adopt today. And we're continuing a story. The Bible makes a lot more sense and has a lot more value because we're going to see cycles that repeat. So in John 11:4, we talk about Lazarus. And Yeshua heard this, he said, the sickness is not to end in death, but for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified by it. So when they come and tell him that Lazarus is sick, he replies coyly that it's not going to end in death. It doesn't say that it's not going to include death. And then it goes on in John 12. It says the people who were with him when he called Lazarus out of the tomb and raised him from the dead continued to testify about him. For this reason also, the people went and met him because they heard that he had performed this sign. So the Pharisees said to one another, you see that you're not doing any good. Look, the world has gone after him, because the Pharisees were trying to stop him from becoming popular. Now, there were some Greeks among those who were going up to worship at the feast. These came to Philip, who were from Bethsaida of Galilee, and began to ask of him, saying, Sir, we wish to see Yeshua. Philip came and told Andrew, and Andrew and Philip came and told Yeshua, and Yeshua answered, said to them, the hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. And then we go down in John 12, a few more verses. It says, Father, glorify your name. Then a voice came out of heaven. I've both glorified it and will glorify it again. So the crowd of people who stood by and heard it were saying that it had thundered. Others were saying, an angel has spoken to him. And Yeshua answered and said, this voice has not come for my sake, but for your sakes. So what we have here is that the death and resurrection of Lazarus that story doesn't end at the chapter 11, at the end of chapter 11. It continues on to chapter 12. This is something we focus on in our ministry quite a lot, that the chapters and verses were added about 1,000 years after the close of Scripture, after the end of the New Testament. These chapters and verses are put in the worst places, and they're not supposed to break up the thought that they break up. We had to study chapters 9 and 10 together because it was one story, and they put a chapter break where the Messiah stopped speaking. Or maybe it's at between 10 and 11. I could be misremembering, but I remember putting two chapters together because it was one long story. And here is the same situation, is that he talks about this Lazarus miracle in John 11, and because of the chapter breaks, we tend to get to the bottom of chapter 11 and go, okay, well, that's the end of that. Turn the page, new story. Chapter 12, new chapter, new scene, new something. But it's not, it's a continuation, because this death and resurrection of Lazarus has now piqued the interest of people who were not interested before, particularly these Greeks. Now, these are Greeks who are already interested in the God of Abraham because they're going up to worship at the festival. So they may already be proselytes. We know that they have some affinity for the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob because they're coming to the festival in Rome-occupied Jerusalem. And now they want to see Yeshua. And what has happened is that this miracle of Lazarus has gathered a bunch of people together that are a mixed multitude. And they get to hear the voice of Yahweh. They get to hear Yahweh's voice right before the Messiah is executed. They get their interest piqued, not by miracles of frogs and turning rivers to red, but by miracles and positive things. They decide to seek out the one true Elohim, and they're blessed. And these people who get to witness Lazarus's resurrection, they get to meet Lazarus, they get to hear about it, they get to see how the Pharisees are trying to stamp this out. Then, maybe 10 days later, get to watch the Messiah, the guy who raised Lazarus from the dead, get executed and then get resurrected by God. And now keys are turning inside their head. And now we see in Acts 2, thousands of people being baptized in the name of Yeshua to be grafted into the family of God if they weren't already native born. So now you know how there's a new mixed multitude in the New Testament. And this is just one small example of the things that we're uncovering at firstcenturychristianity.net. You can join us every week at 1 p.m. Central, either in person if you're in the Kansas City area, or you can come online at Zoom. You have to join our mailing list to join online to get the Zoom code, because we have to kind of be protective because it's interactive. Or you can join on our YouTube channel and watch like you're watching TV. I hope you have a blessed rest of your week, and may Yahweh bless you and keep you in the name of his son, Yeshua.